department, Mizoram University, and the distinguished speaker of the day, Professor Oliver Richmond, FRSA. He is basically a research professor in international peace and conflict studies, Department of Politics and International Relations, the University of Manchester, UK. The distinguished visiting professor at Dublin City University, Ireland, and also University of Tübingen, Germany, University of Coimbra, Portugal. So it is certainly a useful venture as far as our department is concerned. We hardly have such eminent personalities coming on the platform and speaking to us. Definitely, fellow academics as well as research scholars and students of the university derive benefit out of this lecture. And I am sure Professor will certainly give us a sketch of the topic that is very interesting today, because the evolution of international peace architecture is something that is a little technical, but beyond that, we from various parts of the globe will certainly learn something will be useful. And I will not take much of the time. So I request Professor Oliver to deliver the lecture. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone. Plus thanks for the invitation and for hosting me and giving me the opportunity to say a few words about my recent research. I guess everybody's fully aware how significant the theories and practices associated with peacekeeping and peacemaking mediation have been in international relations over the last several centuries. I guess over the last 400 years at least, we've been trying to formulate techniques which would remove war as a political tool from the international system, also end ongoing wars, and therefore by extension be able to politically and diplomatically deal with the sorts of political claims that have in the past and today regularly caused war, whether they were conflicting claims over territory, identity, religion, over resources, and of course over the control of power within the polity. So what I've been trying to do in this recent research is put what has been really a very westernized, very northern-centric set of debates into a broader historical context. And it will come as no surprise to you, the audience today, that much of international relations has been a very westernized theory. Much of it has assumed American and British and European dominance and normative preeminence in the international order. And likewise, many of the tools that we've used for ending wars, from diplomacy to peacekeeping, have prioritized the interests and norms and values of those Western states in a certain type of global stability. So these tools and techniques for making peace in international relations historically have always been connected to the interests of the dominant or hegemonic actors in states or in the international order more broadly. And of course, that has been challenged very substantially throughout the latter part of the 20th century and onwards to today. And one of the reasons why I think this sort of critical historical work in international relations is so significant and so important is because it provides the premise and the basis for our future global development, but it also gives us the opportunity and possibility of designing better political orders which are fairer, more just, more equal, more sustainable, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that I've been trying to do in this work is map out the evolution of thinking and policy practices in dealing with war, and then to put it in this broader critical context in order to be able to evaluate what I'm calling the international peace architecture and its viability for a modern world, in particular the modern world in which we have new technologies, which allow societies, groups, individuals to keep in touch and compare their positions and spread political claims, in which we have various forms of state, and of course in which we have the emergence of a much more diverse multipolar order when compared to particularly the 20th century. So what I've done in this paper is I've sort of unpacked 6 different layers or historical stages in the development of this international peace architecture, a framework or a system which is designed to stabilize international order as it developed. And I've tried to draw some important lessons from it too. I was motivated to take this particular approach by studying some work on archaeology, actually, where archaeologists like Joseph Tainter had been evaluating work that had been done on the collapse of ancient civilizations. And in his work, he'd said, and this is very related, I think, to the development of the modern international system and its peacemaking capabilities. So Tainter had argued that ancient civilizations tended to collapse when they no longer had the tools necessary to resolve their problems and maintain and improve their existing orders. When these systems no longer had the capacity to develop new energy sources, new technologies, and new systems or additions to political systems, they tended to collapse. They tended to become more and more complex over time. So the older a civilization, the greater the level of complexity, the more sophisticated the tools for maintaining order needed to be. And as this goes on, you can see that the pressures on the civilization become greater and greater to innovate, to balance, to produce new tools, new systems and mechanisms to sustain and improve itself. And I've been comparing this to the international peace architecture and more broadly to the international system itself. And you can see a similar sort of trajectory historically. The international system has constantly been tested by war, different types of wars, ethnic, ideological, civil, anti-colonial, and so on and so forth. And every time the system has been tested by war, it's been brought to the verge of collapse, or indeed it has collapsed. And normally after wars, after major systemic wars, a new international system or a reformulated international system has emerged. So that can teach us one thing about the tools for peacemaking in the modern era. They are reactive. They emerge after major wars. They represent an attempt to improve political capability to maintain and preserve and improve order. And therefore they are essential to the survival of the international system itself. So this sort of archaeological approach, I think, is quite interesting because it puts systems like the UN and UN peacekeeping and mediation and international diplomacy, conflict resolution and conflict transformation and all these various theories into a much broader historical perspective. And they emerge from that perspective, not just as minor elements of international relations, but the elements of international relations upon which its design and improvement depend upon. If we can't keep improving our theories and methods for making peace, then the international system will probably collapse, to summarize it very briefly. So what I've done is I've dug back a little bit and tried to examine different stages in the evolution of this framework in the context of those sorts of insights. And of course, the most famous, I suppose, layer or development, early development in international diplomacy and peacekeeping and the building of international institutions was the attempt to develop a European balance of power between the European colonial powers in the several hundred years leading up to the 19th century. And from this, we have a lot of political realism today. The idea that the balance of power is the way in which we solve conflicts, that the units that are being balanced have to be discrete states with their own territories and easily defined boundaries, and that the whole diplomatic and international system of order maintenance emerges from the reason of state, the balance between states, clever diplomacy, and these various tools which make sure that war and violence do not re-enter the political arena as tools. So that's pretty layer one. The foundation of the modern international peace architecture is, for better or worse, the European balance of power system, which was actualized in the Congress of Vienna and the concert system in Europe. So here you can see some positive steps in that we're starting to institutionalize and build a formal political architecture, and we're beginning to push war as a political tool to the margins of practice in international relations. And on the other side of the equation, we know it didn't work very well and didn't last very long. And we also know that it represented the fulcrum of international power as being in the European continent, where there was, according to this logic, a legitimate colonial, imperial, and state context. So you can immediately see that the balance of power mechanism was a weak tool for making peace. It would be unable to preempt war in many cases, and it had no design features that were determined to deal with the contradictions of a state system coexisting with a colonial system, coexisting with an imperial system, which itself was producing a race for power, which we see emerging in the late 19th century into the 20th century. So in the 20th century, with the second layer, we see a big step forward in many ways. And this was the rescuing of a 17th century European political philosophy in order to deal with the failures of the balance of power system, which led to World War I and then to World War II. So this was the liberal peace framework, or liberal internationalism, of the early 20th century, which Wilson, US President Wilson, had famously captured. And it's very different to a sort of the later Gandhian framework, which we'll talk about in a minute, in that it's very much centered on the idea that although states are self-determining entities in the new world, the post-war world of World War I, the rules are set in the West, in the global North, principally by the US and to some degree by the UK. So the whole parameter of peacemaking under liberal internationalism was self-determination, it was democracy within the state, which meant decolonization into what were effectively Eurocentric state units with discrete territories, with individualistic citizens who voted, who had singular identities, it wasn't communal, and so on and so forth. And of course, appended to the liberal peace system was the idea that global cooperation, and in particular trade, was the most important tool for pushing political violence off the platform of legitimate political tools in the 20th century. So layer two, the liberal internationalist framework, to build a liberal international community of democratic states and to use self-determination to decolonize, was an attempt to sort of grab onto the instabilities in the overall foundational framework of geopolitics and the now failed balance of power mechanism of layer one. So we can see a logic here to the building up of the international peace architecture. Layer one was an attempt to deal with a series of wars from the 15th century onwards, which became increasingly catastrophic and major in size, which led to the Napoleonic Wars. It had failed by the end of World War I completely. So a new layer was brought in layer 2, liberal internationalism, to replace it, to improve it, and to stabilize it. And this logic would go through all the 6 layers. Every new layer would be designed at the end of a major systemic clash or crisis to stabilize the previous layers and to deal with new dynamics of war and conflict, each of them trying to push political violence and war out of the terrain of the legitimate practices of the state. So liberal internationalism and the liberal peace, the democratic peace framework that was sort of heralded at the end of World War I in the Treaty of Versailles and the founding of the League of Nations, the building up of international law, the development of minority rights, the thinking about and development of humanitarian law from the Geneva Conventions onwards. You can see that layer 2 really wasn't enough either, because it was very much based upon the idea that European powers led the reshaping of international order and controlled its parameters. There was no real material engagement, so each state was independently required to deal with its own internal conflicts. And this meant that there was a remaining and rather grotesque international inequality between these newly forming states. So it was a very unstable system, and probably almost guaranteed to collapse pretty quickly, because the main hegemon behind it, the United States, withdrew almost immediately from supporting that system. So what this leaves behind is an idea that we're having an international superstructure being formed. But what we're not really doing is dealing with the rights claims and the political claims of the growing constituencies that were emerging within that superstructure around the world. How do you deal with the rights claims of newly self-determining countries that came out of the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the collapse of the British Empire in the 1930s and onwards? How are they brought into the international architecture and the international system? So layer 3, which sort of corresponds to both the ideological Marxist challenge to liberalism and capitalism, as well as to the claim from the global south for development, self-determination, and a place at the table. This was an attempt that runs, from before World War II all the way through to the 1960s, to shift the debate about peace in the international system, not just from the state level, from the balance of power and the nature of liberal constitutions, to also responding more directly to diverse rights claims from different peoples around the world. So layer 3 is sort of filling in some of the gaps that layer 2 had missed. Layer 2 was very focused on political and legal rights. Layer 3 is saying, let's make these rights material for the decolonized subjects of those European empires, and also for those in the sphere of the Soviet Union's influence, who believe that material, social, economic rights are just as important as political and legal rights. Now, the interesting thing is that it's around this period, as layer 3 is kind of developing in the international architecture, certainly by the 1960s, that the United Nations begins to formulate its own tools for making peace. And if you put, and these tools, there were peace observation missions that went to Kashmir and the Golan Heights in the 50s, peacekeeping in the late 50s and 1960s and 70s that went to DRC, to Congo, to Cyprus, to Lebanon, and so on. International mediation and UN special representative peacemaking that was used in places like the Congo and Cyprus and so on. If you compare them to this layer 3 of the international architecture that's coming into being by the 1960s and captured in many of those major General Assembly conventions of that era, these tools are really rather behind. I mean, peacekeeping was much more suited to layer 1, to the balance of power layer of the international architecture of the 19th century. And in fact, peacekeeping really comes out of the practices of imperial policing of the British Empire. And international mediation and diplomacy is sort of also connected to Layer 1. It's something which would have been more at home in the venue of the Concert of Vienna than it probably was in the world of the 1960s and 1970s, where constituencies around the world, new constituencies and new states, are making new political claims. And all of these claims are making new demands on the frameworks in which we make peace, what a peace settlement looks like, how peacemaking operates, how peacekeeping is designed, and so on and so forth. So this enormous mismatch between the much heralded UN tools for making peace in the 1950s and 60s, which were mainly aimed at preventing the Cold War from leading to nuclear war, and the sorts of intellectual challenges that were being identified, and the political claims that were being made from those in the former colonies, those in the East, and so on and so forth, gives a big shove to the development of the international architecture. And what emerges in the 1980s and after the end of the Cold War is a fourth layer. And it's in the fourth layer that you can really see things starting to come together. Now, we call this layer liberal peace building. And the UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali's Agenda for Peace of 1992 was an attempt to capture this early on. And what this really did was that it took the whole framework for peacemaking far beyond the system of sovereign states, centralized authority, territorial demarcation and boundaries, ceasefires, diplomatic mediation. And it set the stage, a platform for non-state actors, social groups to become involved, for transnational social networks to become involved in peace processes, for, in other words, for those expanded rights claims that we see in the previous stages not being met because they're very much focused on security, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and so on, now comes to the fore in Layer 4. And liberal peace building from the 1990s onwards is a much more multidimensional, comprehensive framework. Mainly it met with failure in places like Bosnia and many other, Sierra Leone and Cambodia and many others for various different reasons. But it represented an attempt to design a social contract in post-conflict states through a peace process, through peace building, to leave that state with a liberal constitution and to embed that state in a more stable international and regional security and political order. And also in many ways to lessen the ferocity of centralized government and state borders, and to find ways, as we see in Northern Ireland, perhaps in the most developed extent, of transcending the old sovereign state system of the 19th century. I mean, now it's sort of separated from its imperial base. And what we're left with is these sovereign states that on paper, legalistically, have certain qualities that in reality are often more conflict inducing than conflict managing. So you could say that Layer 4, liberal peace building, as we see it tried in the Balkans, in Bosnia and Cambodia, in Central America, and in several parts of sub-Saharan Africa, over that period, since the end of the Cold War, was, in many ways the most developed. It was also a platform in which more non-Western actors, more non-Western issues, it became slightly less Eurocentric. It began to highlight more and more the injustices and hypocrisies of the way in which peace practices had transferred power from the old European empires to the members of the UN Security Council by the late 20th century. And we began to think about how we would deal with this in processes of UN reform, as well as the development of the UN Peacebuilding Commission and the Peacebuilding Trust Funds, and all of these things that become part of it. This period sees, I think, the possibility that ordinary people can help design peace processes and new constitutional orders in their conflict-affected countries. It sees a massive expansion of global civil society and the numbers of global NGOs, much greater accountability and transparency for state power, for military power, and an attempt to begin to get at some of those niggling long-term instabilities in the international order. But by the late 1990s, of course, this broke down. And one of the reasons for this was because of the war on terror. And what happens with the war on terror is, I think, really a sort of an attack on the Western sort of hegemon, that is the United States, indicated to the US that some of the elements of this Layer 4 liberal peace building framework for making peace were causing more problems than they were able to deal with. And so there was in Layer 5, for the first time in the development of this international peace architecture, a retrogressive step. And this retrogressive step pushed peace practice back towards just focusing on geopolitics, perhaps global trade and global capital, and a basic formulation of the secure state, a small state with security capabilities in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, but not a state that would necessarily be interested in human rights or necessarily be interested in deep forms of democracy, nor contributing to the broadening and deepening of international order itself. So this retrogressive step, the first time that the architecture went back on itself in its last several hundred years of development, has really undermined the legitimacy of the peace project in international relations. And it also began to demonstrate the risk that the ease with which war can be brought back into the political terrain and seen as a legitimate political tool in circumstances that are more than just extreme. And I think this is the problem that we've been facing over the last 20 years, where we've seen the use of chemical weapons in war, we've seen the lack of sanctions, the lack of capacity to stop wars, disinterested intervention from the UN, an inability to gain consensus around the Security Council, and in actual fact, a kind of more moribund international system than we've had since the 1930s, when the League of Nations eventually ended up collapsing. So this isn't an argument, I think, that I'm making to say that the tools that we have for peacemaking have been wonderful and we should keep them going. This is an argument to say that the international system can't survive without better and better tools for peacemaking. So this sort of leads us to the question of, and this is where I can wrap things up for you, but this leads us to a question of, well, what would be a stage 6, given what we know about what's happened since the end of the Cold War in the international peace architecture? It's quite interesting, I think, that throughout the different layers of this architecture, the balance of power layer, the liberal layer of 2, the Marxist layer and the decolonial layer of 3, the sort of globalization layer of 4, and then the state building layer of 5. Throughout each of those layers, there was some historical preparation for what we must do. The balance of power people were really drawing on the history of the small-scale European order over the last 400 years. The liberal internationalists of the early 20th century were drawing on, Kant and Duc de Sully and Abe St. Pierre and 17th century Western political thought, often political thought that was aimed at preventing revolutions and maintaining stability. Layer 3, of course, heavily drawn from Marx and the tradition that Marx offered, as well as from various anti-colonial or post-colonial traditions, from the social movements, non-violent social movements of Gandhi, to the anti-colonial and post-colonial debates about whether to have federal systems in the global south or national systems in the global south, or to unite states, and so on and so forth. In other words, all of these traditions that add to each layer come from a historical repository of knowledge that's been developed in civil society and in academia in different locations a long time previously. And it suggests that what's happening throughout the development of the international architecture is that policymakers run the system into the ground. The system collapses into war. New policymakers then emerge in countries, states, and in the international system who are looking for solutions to avoid that type of war. And to do so, they go back into the knowledge frameworks that have been designed in the past by scholars and by civil society activists, by public personalities, by great thinkers, by statesmen and women, and so on and so forth. So there's something very depressing about this international peace architecture. Its progress depends on damaging collapses, and yet the knowledge that is required to avoid war and to reconstruct or reform the international peace architecture already exists and has often long existed. The liberal peace framework of the 1990s and of the 1920s was designed in the 16th and 17th century and was on paper at that time. Of course, I'm not saying it was wonderful because it was Eurocentric and all that kind of stuff, and it was focused on individualism and capitalism and also on imperialism to a large degree, extraction and so on. But it solved some of the problems that were leading to war at that point. So you can see there is some kind of progression. It's not linear. Layer 5 is a step back. So the question is, what will stage 6 be like? And I think to answer that question, we need to identify the types of conflicts and war that we are at risk of today, and to look back into those civil society, scholarly, social movement literatures to find solutions to them, which then policymakers must adopt before the next systemic war or collapse. And I know that probably sounds like an impossible task. So we're probably going to be left with the usual pattern, which is that we have systemic collapse and then new policymakers are forced to adopt those things anyway. I think one repository of that type of thinking that is in existence today, which I'm very impressed by and is very sophisticated and ticks all of these boxes, is the Sustaining Peace Agenda of the UN. I mean, this document, and if you haven't looked at it, you know, it's set on it comes from a series of General Assembly and committee and also Security Council debates from 2015. It's connected to the Sustainable Development Agenda. And it's very interesting because for the first time, it takes peace as a concept away from the civil terrain or the interstate terrain or the bipolar, multipolar, unipolar terrain of previous debates, and begins to connect it to questions of justice and sustainability. And I think those debates have already been prepared in the global justice literatures with their post-colonial and their environmental and their economic and their historical features. And then in the environmental debates, where we have critical literatures on the effects of the Anthropocene and how it connects to the production of political systems, economic systems, social systems, and of course, violence. So the Sustaining Peace Agenda, I think, does reflect the culmination of scientific innovation. And it prepares the ground for stage 6 of the international peace architecture to provide a rethinking, to stabilize the previous layers, and to respond to their instabilities, the instabilities of the crudity of the balance of power system, the dependence of the liberal peace framework on state sovereignty and territorial integrity, two of the main drivers of modern conflict, the tendency for the West to have implicitly or explicitly rejected material equality as a fundamental basis for war, as well as to have rejected, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, the claims for a fairer distribution of resources and a seat at the various tables in the international system from the countries from the global south, many of which are no longer developing in the same way that they were in the past, are now established. And then the more substantial architecture and the inconsistencies it points to in layer 4, which also needs to be addressed, particularly relating to expanding what what we might call subaltern claims, again, drawing on post-colonial literatures, for justice and sustainability and equality. Now, Layer 5 did none of those things. It rejected them all. Layer 6, if the architecture is to be maintained, now has to take them on. And that's going to be a highly complex and difficult task. To conclude, that takes me back to what Tainter argues in his investigation of the collapse of complex historical societies. He says that basically the paradox of building systems, political systems and political orders and maintaining them through these sorts of tools is that the more success you have over a longer period of time in keeping the peace, in maintaining political order, the more complex the future task of maintaining order is. And I think that's exactly what we can see now. Making peace in today's world is so complex because it runs across security and justice and power and the social contract and the distribution of resources and the development of new technologies and so many areas. And it's that complexity which demands a lot of attention and coalitions of cooperative actors working together and enormous resources. And we can see a real deficit in those areas. There's little political will, few resources. The coalitions of actors are present, but they are being disrupted by revanchist and reactionary, often hyper-nationalist, old-style territorial states trying to control, re-grab, the reins of power all over the world. And, we have our own example in the UK, Boris Johnson, who has wrecked the Northern Ireland Agreement with his Britain First nationalist Brexit. We had the same thing with Trump, destabilized peace process all around the world with his America First, and so on and so forth. So this very reactionary sort of 19th century return to the balance of power and the sovereign state is undermining the entire peace architecture and destabilizing it. So I think that's the primary problem to address. If we could address that problem, which sometimes feels very unlikely, then we can return to that UN sustaining peace agenda and the very clever and comprehensive way in which it's captured the repository of knowledge about how to maintain and keep peace in international order, and perhaps make a better stab at implementing it this time. What comes out of this, I think, most clearly is that these layers and systems and approaches are not just peripheral to human progress and world order and the development of the state, but they're absolutely essential to it. And in fact, in the past, these systems have been designed after war to maintain a previous and often unsuitable political order. And now we have to rejig that. The systems need to, in a sense, preempt war and have a much more wholehearted role in the revision of political order, both domestic and international. That means reforms of the state, reforms of regional organizations, reforms of the social contract below the state and those regional organizations, and very substantial UN reform too. Until those things are off the agenda, we're perhaps trapped in this slowly declining, almost moribund international architecture. And perhaps I think I've spoken for about 40 minutes, so I should leave it there, if that's okay.
Thank you, Professor Richard. That has been a wonderful presentation. Actually, this is a kind of a new thing to us in terms of the toolkits for the peace architecture and with different layers that you have suggested. This is a wonderful presentation. Having said that, I have got some, comments to make.
Right.
First of all, you did refer to the hegemon since the days of British, Pax Britannica and Pax America. And following the ending of the Cold War, we have witnessed a confused state of world order, wherein we have got various institutions getting eroded, the powers of the institutions, multilateral institutions getting eroded, and also emergence of some new players. And to name a few, you have China, you have India, you have Brazil, you have South Africa, and in security as well as non-security areas. Because you have to remember that when you talk about peace, peace is in a peace architecture, it is not a question of resolving the conflict, bloody conflict or wars, but also at the same time you have to take into account the non-security issues which are predominant, at least for a while. That was the low politics dominating the high politics, at least during the second ending of the Second World War, because people were clamoring for economic prosperity and so on, including Europe, the US, or even the colonized world. The point that I am trying to make is that in the present context, when there is a decline of the hegemon and the total relinquishment of the responsibility of the hegemon, or the abdication of the responsibility of the hegemon, what kind of presently you might have seen the realignment of forces like Quad, like Asia Pacific region, and also the United States becoming closer and closer to India, just to counter, I don't know, to counter or to make some kind of its presence in South Asia, or for that matter to counter China. These are some of the issues that are making, when you talk about the layers, the present layer is definitely not articulated one, is not a concrete layer, and it is a kind of amorphous structure that we find. And this is a kind of a sense of confusion and I would say instability, in my opinion, which may bring in some kind of chaos. I would say that is a very strong word, but in some kind of this. And as you said, the BOP, the balance of power, is a weak tool since the beginning. You have been because you said it's a weak tool since the beginning to make peace. And these kind of movements by the declining hegemon and the emerging powers like India or China, how are you going to just account for your peace architecture? That's my question. And after this, let me tell you, after my answering my question, some of the participants have posted their question and answer in the box, and which I will read out. First of all, can you please respond to my comment?
Sure. Please. Thank you very much for that. It's very insightful. And, I think that the international peace architecture as it's developed has been an afterthought of the principal Western powers, mainly, who have been in this position where their epistemology has allowed them to put themselves at the center, and their power has practically made them at the center. And I think those two things have broken down, and they are finding it increasingly difficult to justify how they think about international relations and peace, security, and order. And it's the inconsistencies that are becoming, the hypocrisies that are becoming more and more obvious to people who look around the world because of new technological conditions where we can communicate. We are not slaves to our states or political elites anymore, but we can quite easily bypass them. And so what we sort of have is a peace system which is built on the old world, in which military and diplomatic political actors dominated the levers and institutions of power. And that has become a multipolar world, as you rightly point out. But also beyond that multipolar world, there is also a new world of networks, often informal networks using these new technologies, in which people are constantly debating the premises of a better form of politics, a better form of political order, peace, who's responsible, justice, what needs to be done, and these sorts of things. And these two worlds, the multipolar world and this kind of informal technological world, a kind of digital international relations, are not really connected as yet, but they are influencing each other. And peace praxis hasn't really dug into that area either. Now, I don't think, I've just written a paper with a colleague from Waseda University. His name is Yuji Yasuji, and it's on really what China and India's positions are with respect to the international peace architecture in an increasingly multipolar world, as you have suggested. And what we find really is that there's a common agreement on the kind of capitalist cooperation, scientific cooperation, and trade elements of the international peace architecture, but there isn't much agreement on the political, social, cultural elements of that architecture. And the other problem that we seem to be noticing is that the trade, cooperation and scientific cooperation elements only go so far, because of course increasingly we've seen that particularly the US and Britain has been pulling out of some of these arrangements because it feels like it's economically been undermined domestically with the Britain first, Trump first, type things. And where we have this kind of limited engagement, there are increasingly more and more reserved areas. So in the previous system of liberal peace building, this was really meant to deal with the wars that came out of the collapse of the empires and the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And what we haven't had is a peace framework which is meant to deal with the conflicts that are emerging in a world where we have the advent of multipolarity to a degree which we've not seen, for centuries, perhaps ever, and also a new political platform, which is the informal sphere, the networks that are burgeoning around the world, where truth and post-truth are being debated and disseminated. So the international system and the peace architecture is not fit for purpose. It doesn't fully reflect any of those things. It doesn't even partially reflect any of those things. And in fact, often on the kind of Security Council and political side, it seems to be supporting different claims for hegemony. So what we saw in this paper that we did on comparing China, India, and the West was that China likes developmental peace building as long as it opens markets and doesn't involve challenges to its own political order. It has a tendency to preferring authoritarianism as a kind of developmental partner. And so it thinks about peace not necessarily in political terms, but quasi-political terms, if you like, as finding good partners. And the kind of UN framework went a bit further than that, because it extended the ways in which it thought about peace down to the kind of rights that individuals in conflict-affected societies would experience, but then it reserved those interventions only for a few conflicts that came out of colonialism and came out of the end of the Soviet Union, where the Security Council members weren't that bothered, and all the rest you couldn't have anything to do. So, we end up with a lot of untreated conflicts where there's just too much at stake for the international peace architecture to really get involved in. And these range from Tibet to, as you know, Kashmir, and many, many others around the world. They kind of reserve spaces for the interests of the superpowers and the multipolar powers that are emerging. That's really problematic for the international peace architecture, because it's an exclusion, it's a limitation, and any one of these conflicts could collapse the entire system. So we can't have a peace architecture which is only used in certain circumstances, but not in other circumstances. It can't maintain international order. And to doubly emphasize that, what we've seen through the evolution of the international peace architecture and in historical terms is that within those exclusions, so where very powerful states keep the international peace architecture out because it deems it to be too substantial for its own national interest to have other actors involved or to have a change of normative setting, they tend to fail. And then those other actors in the end do have to come in. But the failure sparks a massive escalation. And that escalation leads to perhaps a systemic collapse. So you see what I'm saying here. I mean, the exclusions that revolve around many elements of the conflict in the Middle East, for example, could collapse the whole international system. So I think this is the number one problem that we tend to face. And we can see this as we spread through, as the international architecture is expanding, the numbers of exclusions are expanding. As multipolar actors become more active within that architecture, there are more and more exclusions in the international peace architecture. And what I could say to try and summarize that phenomena, which I think is extremely dangerous, is that soon the exclusions will be more prevalent than the peace architecture if this carries on. So all of those conflicts that are untreated, take Yemen or Syria, and then many others around the world, will add up to something more than what we used to call the zones of peace, governed by the international peace architecture and agreed norms and values and so on and so forth. So a question really here, I call this counter peace, okay? So where we have an international peace architecture, there is also a growing counter peace architecture. This opposes peace. Many states, many actors don't want peace. War is a system of profit and rent and extraction. It's very useful if you can control war. And that's the mistake that I think we always make historically. War is an uncontrollable phenomenon. That's why we have the international peace architecture. So we have a kind of rationality which is upside down. You know, actors in the counter peace architecture often think that war is a controllable, usable political tool. I don't think we see that with many of the actors in the multipolar system. I'd be concerned about Russia. I think Russia always has verged a little bit on crossing the line, and you can see that with its hybrid warfare. It's testing the waters. It's asking the question of the rest of the multipolar actors, how far can we use war as a political tool in the modern world and still maintain control of war and its tendency to escalate uncontrollable? I think the historical answer to that question is not very much, and it's extremely risky. So the problem with the multipolar developments is not so much that we're getting more representation and a broader set of members in the international architecture. It's that they haven't come to an agreement on what peace and order means in the modern world. The very basic agreement is capitalism. And yet much of the scientific literature tells us that unrestricted capitalism causes war. So there's a paradox at the heart of the modern international multipolar order, which is extremely dangerous. And the architecture, the peace architecture, is not equipped yet in practice to deal with it. It is equipped in theory, and practitioners could draw on that theory, but they're not.
Fair enough. Fair enough, Professor Richmond. Actually, just a small interjection. Actually, when you talk about this peace architecture, don't you think there is a need for greater democratization and power sharing by incorporating those counter narratives with regard to this peace process? Because all through, you rightly said in the beginning that all through this has been a Eurocentric narrative, and post the First World War, Second World War, it is American-centric narrative. Now this, as I have already said, the emergence of some newer power structures, power centers, as well as you referred to the West Asia and all these things, and even Russia, all these things in a new avatar. So don't you think that there is a need to have greater, kind of, incorporation of all these people and democratization at the international system in the latest layer of your peace architecture? Just briefly, you just respond to this, because there are a couple of questions which you need to answer. Please.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, these are the things that we need to talk about in Layer 6. These are the discussion that we've been having. I think this is what Layer 6 needs to be about if we are to stop the international system from crashing and stop the next major systemic war from starting the cycle all over again. I think the UN has started that, and scholars, academics, civil societies all around the world have the capacity to network and discuss these things. We are preparing this body of knowledge. But the really troubling thing about it is that, as I said earlier, in the past, it seems to take on average 300 years for a body of peace-oriented knowledge to make it into practice. Now, I think we're basically faced with a system collapse in the next decade, and we don't have 300 years to wait. So, is one of the features of modernity that we can speed up this insertion of scientific and ethical knowledge into policy practice? I mean, it seems to me that the multipolar movements that have emerged in the last 10 to 15 or 20 years in international relations have been mainly aimed at reinserting national interests, not renegotiating multilateral interests or scientific interests, so they're more representative and fairer. Everybody's still defending their corner, but with more and more power. I mean, that is obviously going to end in a crash.
Okay. Let us take a couple of questions from the participants. Lopomudra Ghosh, she asks, how do you think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can be resolved? Just briefly, you can answer.
Yeah, that's a big question.
Architecture, yeah.
Look, I mean, empirically speaking, I think the in the global north, the case that we can all turn to is Northern Ireland. You know, conflicts that are over territory, identity, historical justice, imperialism, and hegemony. You know, many of them in the global north share those characteristics. And the one that's been settled to a large degree, although of course it's in the news recently because Brexit has messed it up, the settlement, has been Northern Ireland. And what happened in Northern Ireland was, you know, after years of small-scale war and terrorism and counter-terrorism and all the usual, you know, failures of the modern state system, we had a high level and track to civil society back channel type process in which were negotiated parameters which softened or removed almost entirely borders, singular centralized authority, allowed multiple territorial claims to coexist and different identities and religious sectarian identities to coexist too. It was painful and took a long time. It was extremely difficult. It was embedded in a regional organization, the EU, which allowed freedom of movement, freedom of trade, and all expanded forms of rights. It was a new type of polity. And what we see now in this very reactionary moment that we're currently in is, I mean, certainly in Britain, the political right here, the anti-revolutionary, anti-rights, pro-state, pro-centralized power, I mean, a sort of social Darwinist kind of thinking, if you like, feel that many of those innovations that led to the Northern Ireland settlement, the Good Friday Accords, and the various adjustments afterwards, actually undermined, were existential threats to the British state. Yes, they were. That was the point. And I think, you know, in the end, it seems to me that peace settlements and peace processes and those various tools are about the unpacking of long-standing systems of power and the redistribution of resources and the provision of justice. And I know a lot of people would say, but this goes too far and we can't do things about historical injustice. There can't be restitution and so on and so forth, but we can do reconstruction. Well, I mean, if we look at the track record of peace processes over the last 30 or 40 years, as far as I can see, there are only a handful that have worked. So, you know, it's really maybe 1 in 20 that went anywhere. Most of them have failed. So at what point do we recognize that the strategies have failed? You know, there's been a process going on in the Middle East, well, since the how far do we go back? It's almost a century old. There's been a mediation and peacekeeping process in Cyprus since 1963. They keep reconvening new rounds of UN Secretary General mediation between the former warring parties in Cyprus. That's been going on since 63. I mean, it's almost, the peace process is almost more substantial than the state itself in that case, not in the Middle East. So I think it's time for a reassessment and to be, you know, to look at things in the cold light of day. The previous strategies haven't worked. The system of territorial sovereignty, which was used to settle many colonial conflicts, hasn't worked. capitalism is also contradicting peace settlements to a large degree. Enclosing peace settlements within the state hasn't worked because many of the dynamics of conflict are regional or global, the ones that feed, cause, and sustain conflict. So we need a paradigm shift. And I think, my answer to how can the Israeli-Palestinian conflict be resolved is, well, look at Northern Ireland. There was a paradigm shift. We completely rethought the nature of political order. It was accidental, but it's instructive. And that's what we need in Israel-Palestine too. And I'm afraid justice has to be at the center of that, I think.
Okay, we can take another question. How can peace-building activities be used in reducing the risk of relapsing into conflict and laying the foundation for sustainable peace and development? Same peace architecture question.
Yeah. So, I mean, this relates to, I think this relates to institution building and law, basically. I mean, what emerges out of the discourse of civil society quite often is a demand for rights, to use a kind of shorthand, because this is convoluted and complex. And when rights claims start to emerge, I have a right to an identity, I have a right to a livelihood, I have a right to public services, I have a right to security, I have a right to, all the legal human rights, basic first, second, third, fourth, fifth generation and more. When they begin to emerge and they are voiced, then the constitutional framework has to respond to them. And you could see this, peace settlements are often about revising constitutions and building new institutions and connecting those institutions to supranational institutions that can guarantee and stabilize in security terms and in political terms, in legal terms, and so on. So I think the big innovation of the 20th century really was the attempt to use liberal political theory on the nature of the best constitutional order, because it's connected to so many things, to the social contract and civil and human rights, to the political legal framework of the state, and to international law as well. Of course, the problem is that as we've just been discussing in the previous question, because the constitutional order is appended to a type of state, a territorially integral, sovereign type of state, which has the right of non-intervention. Many of these rights are very positive, but they also have consequences and knock-on effects. They are often also contradictory. So I think we need to think about constitutional technologies and institutional technologies too in our revision of stage 6. The world history didn't end with the discovery of checks and balances under liberal individualism and liberal constitutional orders. And in fact, with the with the the expansion of international order that's emerged in the 20th century, we have for the first time the possibility of a much more representative order than has ever existed in human history. I know that a lot of kind of Western actions in international order seem to suggest that we in the West and the global North are intent on preventing broader representation, but that's only a part of the story. I think power structures are intent on preserving their privileges, but scholarship, civil society, social actors, political parties, many people who are on the slightly weaker side, if you like, are intent on making sure there is this thing called global justice built into international order. So in the past, in the 1990s, peace building was connected to liberal constitutionalism. I think now it needs to be connected to expanded notions of global justice in order to have legitimacy. The reason why many peace agreements collapsed in the 1990s and 2000s was because it turned out they weren't that legitimate with their host populations in places like Cambodia, where it went to an authoritarian state, and so on and so forth. So how do we build legitimacy for peace agreements? Well, we have to connect them to the latest knowledge that we have about what makes justice, what makes consensus, what makes cooperation. And we haven't been doing that. We've been denying it. We, for example, still commonly deny that equality is a feature of a peace process.
we have an observation, a comment from Professor Srinivas Pathi. He says, when we think of architecture, we think of resources, cost, and sustainability. In your view, how can these issues be addressed in your discourse of peace architecture, local, regional, or even global?
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, one of the insights that comes from, I took from Joseph Tainter's archaeological exegesis was that the, the architecture itself is always behind in its, but when you build something, it's already too little too late, always goes over cost, and, needs to be replaced on a regular basis. And I think that's the point that you're getting at. We still haven't arrived at a situation where there's sufficient international political will or provision of resources on the international stage for peace activities. And yet peace activities are, absolutely crucial. They're essential for the maintenance of international order. So how do we do this? Well, I mean, the long-standing debates over UN reform would be one step. The continued expansion of the donor system will be another. Both of these have been blocked or put into reverse. The increased connection between global civil societies, global tax regimes, there's a lot to do, which is on the agenda intellectually, but is being rejected politically, often, by the way, by democratic majorities, which is something we need to think about. What happens when dominant majorities in the global north with the capacity to implement some of the changes that we need to expand an architecture, what happens when they democratically reject the idea of aid or investment in the UN or supporting UN peacekeeping, or they reject the possibility of expanding the UN Security Council, and so on and so forth? I mean, we're sort of at a stage where it appears possible that without new checks and balances, democracy can also have all of these contradictory effects on the broader international system. Sorry, I can't hear you.
I think
This
time is almost over, sir. May
it's almost over. Yeah.
may I request Professor K.R.S. Samashivarao, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, to make his intervention, and then we will have a proposal vote of thanks.
Vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Oliver ji. It was wonderful lecture, and many people, the participants are appreciating in the chat box. Everybody is happy about your lecture, and it was wonderfully explained, and people are very happy. I'm really thankful on behalf of all the participants and on behalf of our university. I thank you very much for your kindness and giving very elaborative explanations for all the questions, and you have given a very good, nice explanation on peace architecture. Thank you very much. I'm a science man, but I could understand the gist of the lecture.
Thank you very much for those gracious words. It's very nice of you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much, sir, for your kind patience and intervention at the end. Now, may I request Dr. J.C. Zomathanga, our youngest colleague in the department, assistant professor, to propose formal vote of thanks so that we can conclude.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Oliver Paul Richmond, who speaks all the way from Manchester, and that was a very lively presentation, especially with regard to the peace architecture, because in this world of conflict, the world needs peace, and the only way we can have peace is through the insights that people have done with the knowledge and architecture. And I believe that this was a very lively presentation, a very useful one, I should suggest. And therefore, I would like to thank first and foremost Professor Richmond for your valuable time that you had spared in giving us your valuable lectures and insights on this webinar. And secondly, I would like to thank Vice Chancellor and a Pro Vice Chancellor who had been instrumental in organizing this webinar. so that we can have access to that wonderful presentation of this peace architecture, which the world needs very immediately in this conflictual world. And I would like to thank all the participants who are able to join this webinar and who have made it a success of this webinar. Thank you one and all for this wonderful time. And I sincerely hope that through
I just wanted to say one word, Oliver ji. Actually, Mizoram is known to be the most peaceful state in the country. And out of 29 states in India, Mizoram is the #1 peaceful state. So your lecture very rightly articulates to Mizoram state.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time and for all the participants and the VC and the Pro VC for their inputs for the success of this webinar. Thank you one and all.
Thank you, and good luck with all your studies.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice.
Nice to meet you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.